Ever wondered how ideological differences could split the world into two opposing factions? Let's journey back to the aftermath of World War II. As the smoke of World War II cleared, the world found itself divided, not by borders, but by ideologies. On one side stood the United States, the shining beacon of capitalism and democracy. On the other, the Soviet Union, a formidable stronghold of communism and state control. Two superpowers, each with its own vision for the future of the world, locked in a struggle that would shape the course of the 20th century. But how did this ideological conflict come about? To answer that, we need to delve into the political and economic roots of the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union, once allies against the Axis powers, found themselves at odds over the fate of Europe in the post-war period. While America sought to rebuild Europe with the Marshall Plan, promoting democratic governance and free market economies, the Soviet Union aimed to extend its sphere of influence, establishing communist regimes in Eastern Europe. This stark division of Europe, known as the Iron Curtain, symbolized the growing rivalry between the superpowers. The United States, fearing the spread of communism, adopted a policy of containment aimed at blocking Soviet influence and preventing the domino effect of countries falling to communism. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, saw the actions of the United States as a threat to its own security and ideology. Meanwhile, the global economy was undergoing significant changes. The United States emerged from the war as an economic powerhouse, its industries booming and its currency dominating the world market. The Soviet Union, having suffered immense losses during the war, focused on heavy industry and military power, seeking to compete with the United States on the global stage. As the 1940s drew to a close, it became clear that this was not just a battle for territory, but a battle for the hearts and minds of people around the world. It was a cold conflict, fought not on the battlefield, but in the realm of politics, economics, and ideology. Thus, the stage was set for a conflict that would last for almost half a century. As the Cold War began, the United States made a strategic move to contain the spread of communism. This move was embodied in the Truman Doctrine, a policy named after President Harry S. Truman. The doctrine was a pledge to provide economic and military aid to countries threatened by communism or totalitarian ideologies. It marked the start of the United States policy of containment, a strategy aimed at preventing the spread of communism globally. To further bolster this, the United States rolled out the Marshall Plan, a massive economic aid package designed to rebuild war-torn Europe and create a buffer against Soviet influence. Additionally, the United States led the formation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, a military alliance aimed at countering the Soviet Union's power. These actions were not just about protecting democracy, but also about asserting the United States' influence on the global stage. This policy set the tone for the confrontations to come. Next, we turn to the divided city of Berlin, a focal point of early Cold War tensions. The year was 1948 and the city found itself split into 4 zones, each controlled by one of the victorious powers of World War II. The Soviet Union, however, had other plans. They initiated the Berlin Blockade, cutting off all land and water routes into West Berlin, effectively turning the city into an island within Soviet-occupied East Germany. But the Western Allies weren't about to abandon the city. They responded with the Berlin Airlift, a remarkable logistical feat that saw planes landing in West Berlin every 3 minutes at the height of operations, delivering vital supplies to the blockaded city. This daring aerial operation lasted for more than a year, further escalating the tensions between the superpowers and setting the stage for the long, frosty standoff that was the Cold War. Berlin, a city divided, became a symbol of the Cold War. Now let's shift our focus to the Korean Peninsula, the stage for one of the first major proxy wars of the Cold War. The Korean War, beginning in 1950 and lasting until 1953, was a conflict that embodied the global power struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union. The war erupted when North Korea, supported by Soviet forces, invaded the South, triggering a United Nations response led by the United States. This conflict was not only about the fate of a divided Korea, but also a manifestation of the broader ideological clash between communism and democracy. Key battles, such as those at Incheon and the Chosin Reservoir, were emblematic of the brutal and fluctuating nature of the war. In the aftermath, the Korean peninsula remained divided at the 38th parallel, locked in a tense and unresolved armistice. The war left Korea in ruins and claimed millions of lives. The Korean War was a clear example of the global reach of Cold War tensions. In 1962, the world held its breath as the United States and the Soviet Union came dangerously close to nuclear war. The Cuban Missile Crisis, often viewed as the pinnacle of Cold War tensions, was a 13-day standoff that had the globe teetering on the brink of nuclear catastrophe. This was Brinkmanship at its peak. The Soviet Union under Nikita Khrushchev had installed nuclear missiles in Cuba, a mere 90 miles from US shores. The discovery of these missile sites by US intelligence sparked a crisis that brought the two superpowers to the edge of war. President John F. Kennedy and his advisors navigated a delicate path between diplomacy and military action. The world watched, waited, and hoped for a peaceful resolution. Ultimately, an agreement was reached. The Soviets would remove their missiles from Cuba, and the US secretly agreed to dismantle missile bases in Turkey. The Cuban Missile Crisis showed just how high the stakes were in the Cold War. Meanwhile, the superpowers were competing for dominance not only on Earth, but also in space. This rivalry, known as the space race, became a symbol of Cold War competition. It kicked off in October 1957 when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite. This event sent shockwaves around the world and prompted the United States to accelerate its own space program. In 1961, the Soviet Union achieved another significant milestone, sending the first human, Yuri Gagarin, into space. The United States, not to be outdone, set its sights on the moon. Under the Apollo program, they achieved this ambitious goal in July 1969, when astronaut Neil Armstrong took his iconic "one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." The space race was another front in the Cold War, a peaceful yet highly competitive struggle for supremacy. It showcased the technological prowess and ambition of both superpowers, leaving a lasting legacy on our understanding of space exploration. The Vietnam War was a Cold War conflict that had far-reaching consequences. It was not just a battle between the North and the South of Vietnam. No, it was much more than that. It was a proxy war, a stage where the United States and the Soviet Union, along with China, played out their ideological differences. The United States, aiming to contain the spread of communism, supported South Vietnam. Meanwhile, North Vietnam received support from both the Soviet Union and China. The impact of this war was multifold. It led to devastating loss and destruction in Vietnam and intensified the global tensions of the Cold War. Despite the United States' significant military involvement, the war ended in 1975 with the fall of Saigon to the north, marking a significant blow to the US containment policy. The Vietnam War added another layer to the complex dynamics of the Cold War. Despite the ongoing conflicts, there were also attempts to ease tensions during the Cold War. One such period was known as Detente, a French term meaning relaxation. This was a time of increased diplomacy and negotiations, a temporary thawing of the icy relations between the United States and the Soviet Union. The goal? To reduce the risk of nuclear confrontation that ominously hung over the world. The key focus of Detente was arms control. Both superpowers recognized the mutual destruction that a nuclear war would bring. This led to important arms control agreements like the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, or SALT. The first, SALT I, signed in 1972, froze the number of strategic ballistic missile launchers. The second, SALT II, signed in 1979, sought to curtail the manufacture of strategic nuclear weapons. Detente was a brief respite in the Cold War, an attempt to bring stability to a volatile world. The Cold War also saw superpowers supporting opposing factions and governments in third countries. This intriguing phenomenon of proxy wars and regime changes became another battlefield in the Cold War chess game. Let's take a closer look. In Afghanistan, the Soviet Union supported a communist regime, while the United States backed the Mujahideen resistance. This led to a devastating decade-long conflict, with the country becoming a battleground for opposing ideologies. Meanwhile, in Central America, the United States involved itself in various conflicts supporting anti-communist regimes and insurgencies. Nicaragua and El Salvador became hotspots of Cold War tensions, with the US fearing the spread of Soviet influence in its own backyard. In Africa, superpowers played a similar game. Angola and Mozambique, for instance, saw heavy involvement from both the US and the Soviet Union, each supporting different factions in their civil wars. These proxy wars and regime changes were another way the Cold War played out around the globe. Finally, in 1989, the world witnessed the symbolic end of the Cold War. A year marked by political upheaval and change, the most iconic event of this transformative period was undoubtedly the fall of the Berlin Wall. This concrete barrier, which had divided East and West Berlin since 1961, had become a powerful symbol of the ideological divide between the capitalist West and the communist East. But winds of change were blowing. In the Soviet Union, General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev had initiated political and economic reforms known as perestroika and glasnost, aiming to revitalize the stagnating Soviet system. Meanwhile, popular uprisings were sweeping across Eastern Europe as people demanded freedom and democracy. Then, on November 9th, East German officials made a stunning announcement. The Berlin Wall was open. It was a moment of joy and disbelief as Germans from both sides began tearing down the wall. And so, the Cold War ended not with a bang, but with the peaceful fall of a wall.